Hello, welcome. Thank you so much for listening. If you're listening on the podcast and watching, if you're watching on YouTube, another truly special guest I have that has agreed to talk to me, and I'm really excited about this. He is, of course, Keith, but many of you probably know him as Vintage Card Curator. He has had a really informative YouTube channel for quite a while when it comes to sports cards, especially vintage cards on the baseball side. But he's been involved in the hobby for a while, and I have a lot of questions for him. But I'm just excited that he agreed to come on and talk about his history in the hobby. Keith, first of all, thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome, Kurt. It's really an honor to be asked. This is the first interview I've ever done, and I'm really happy. I love talking about the hobby. I love talking about cards, so I'm looking forward to it.
Well, I'm honored. I'm your first. uh, yeah, well, you got started in the hobby and how that got started for you, and what were some of the things that you started collecting when you first got into it?
Yeah, I have I think probably a unique story about getting in the hobby. I started getting cards when I was like 8 years old. I'm 57 right now. And like a lot of people, I started collecting non-sport cards. So I was really big into wacky packages when those were a thing. And I got my first baseball cards probably like 1974, 1975, and started really collecting just for the love of collecting. And I've got actually this is my original album from 1975 and some of the first cards I ever got. My grandmother got these for me. And so, collecting has really had a special place for me. So I collected from 1975 to 1981. And back then, for the old time collectors, it was all about building sets. The hobby
Hmm.
was just so different. I mean, all the kids, that I knew collected, and all we wanted to do was finish that 660 card set. And even if you bought, hundreds and hundreds of packs, you couldn't do it. There was always a few cards you needed. And I never completed any of the sets I had as a kid. Um, so then I got into high school, and I really got out of cards. 81 was the last set that I collected, and then I didn't do anything with cards at all. I was a baseball fan, but didn't collect. The junk wax era came. I was an adult working. I did not collect cards or anything, and it wasn't until around 2017 that I was in the process of going through some of the stuff in my house and selling it off. I sold a bunch of my comic books, and I got to the baseball card box, and I brought out my old cards, and my mom didn't throw any of those away. I still had them all. And, I started looking at them, and I did start selling some of them. But then I made the mistake of going to the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown and walking through some of those stores and seeing some of the history of the game. And it really just rekindled it. I think I, remembered like why I was doing it. So this was like a 36-year gap in collecting. And even now, I'm thinking about cards every day, and I have really almost no interest in the modern game of baseball. Like I really can't tell you
Hmm.
the players except for the stars. It just vintage. That's all I really care about, vintage baseball. And I know this is a basketball card channel,
Oh yeah.
but it's like the stuff I really enjoy is like 1968 to 1975, 76, and that's kind of what I focus on.
Cool. I mean, yeah. I mean, even though my focus is basketball and vintage basketball in particular is what I tend to
Okay.
focus on, but I like hearing about other people who collect vintage baseball, vintage football, all the other vintage and even non-sports vintage stuff because vintage to me is still just that connector to the history of those sports, whether it's baseball or basketball or whatever.
Right.
And so I always think that people who really start getting into vintage always, well, not always, but they tend to have a much more passion for the history of the sport and the history of what they're collecting, including the history of the cards themselves, not just the players on them. And so that's why I always love getting into conversations with vintage collectors because I always feel like I learn a bunch every single time I talk to just about anybody, whether it's a baseball collector, a football, or a hockey, or whomever.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I totally agree. I've had baseball history books since I was probably 7 or 8 years old when I was, a young reader myself, and have always been interested in the history of the game, and come to really appreciate the history of the hobby too. It's so fascinating. I got my first baseball card book in 1976, and just to learn, what the old time collectors were doing, and to see how the hobby has evolved over the years. And there's some fantastic books about the hobby as well that really kind of kept me going. Before I even got back into cards, I was still interested and was learning a little bit about what was going on with graded cards, and with some of the top cards in the hobby. I still kind of saw it from afar, but I love the history of collecting. And to me, it's primarily a nostalgia thing, like others. I mean, it takes me
Mhm.
back to when I was a kid. And as an adult, it's attaining the cards that I could never have gotten when I was a child, because back then, if these cards were not circulating in the neighborhood from an older brother or dad, we didn't have access to them. There were no card shows, there were no card shops. Sometimes I bought some cards through the mail, through some of the ads in Baseball Digest or Sporting News, but you really didn't have access to vintage at all. So for me as an adult, it's really incredible to pretty much have every set that I really ever wanted to have. Right now I've got the 68 tops through the 81 tops, and I don't really have a desire to go back much older, but it's just, that it's really collecting first and foremost.
So in that date range, what's your favorite set? Do you have a favorite?
Man, it's hard. I think as what I did as an adult was I would have different methods of putting the sets together. So
Mhm.
like the 1975 top set, I just bought it on eBay, and then I replaced the cards that needed to be upgraded. But as you get older, as you get further and further back, it's almost impossible. Like to buy a 1967 or 1968 or 69 set, it's like, $2,500, 3,000, and even then you're replacing cards. So those sets I had to build kind of in groups or card by card. And I think when you are building those sets and buying cards individually, it really forges an incredible connection with the set. You get to know the players, which cards are really tough to find, which ones are easier, which ones show up all the time for auction. You just get, it's more a deeper connection. So I think probably 1972 Topps baseball is probably my favorite. I bought a complete set, and then it needed a lot of upgrades, but I think chasing those high number cards was really a lot of fun. It taught me a lot about the set, and it probably kind of took me back to what it was like as a kid trying to accumulate and complete. I can't even imagine, trying to complete 787 cards as a kid in 1972. That had to be almost impossible.
It always makes me laugh to hear about the ridiculous numbers of all those baseball sets.
Yes. Yeah. Well, it's
Because
also,
as a
yeah.
basketball, because as a basketball guy, I think most of the, I mean, the highest number set is probably like 250 or 300 for the most part.
Oh, wow.
And most baseball sets, so yeah, you usually double that. It's like, oh my gosh, I couldn't even
Yeah.
imagine. Yeah,
Yeah. You probably have a longer collecting season, but in baseball. And
right.
when
Yeah.
I back in the 70s, I just didn't see the basketball cards out that much, and people were just not collecting them. I didn't have any. I
Mhm.
didn't have any football cards or anything. It was only baseball. But I think what it also taught me as an adult is not to chase the crowd like what everybody else is doing, because back then everything was about set building. No one said, "Hey, let's just go get all the Mickey Mantles we can. Let's get all the Hank Aaron's. Let's try to get Hall of Fame." Like back, there were no rookie cards back then. That was something I think really constructed around 1980, 1981. The idea that this one card is more valuable than the other players' cards. And so I
Right.
think as an adult now, you want to look at what maybe going in a different direction from everybody else. Now, like if I was to go back into the 70s or 80s now, you'd be buying packs and just storing them. You'd be buying as many vintage Mantles or Aaron's, Clementes as you could, and back then that would have been looked at almost, I wouldn't say laughed at, but it would be definitely going against the grain, and no one was doing that. Back then, nobody was autographing cards from the player. I went to see, we had a signing when I was like 12 years old. Dennis Eckersley came to a local department store, and I had his cards, but the last thing I would have done was put the cards in front of him to sign. So he like signed my yearbook, just like the way things change over time is, and how things are established and standard. And then a few decades later, that was taboo. You don't do that anymore. It's kind of fascinating when you're around long enough to see it.
Yeah, I recently got heavily into collecting signed vintage basketball, and a big reason was because like it was just so frowned upon for so many years, and then all of a sudden I'm looking at like pop numbers and things like that for signed stuff of basketball sets from the 60s and even the 70s, and they're just so rare and low still for a lot of those players because they weren't asked to sign for a really long.
Yeah.
And now they're signing quite a bit if they're still around and if they're signing. But yeah, back then, and there are a lot of players that either passed away or just decided not to sign, even if they are living today. But yeah, it's really interesting when you come to that realization of, wow, there's a lot of truly rare, unique stuff that you can try and get into if you're going into like the signed sets of the 60s and 70s and even further back, obviously. And that just really piqued my interest. And as a basketball nerd, as a basketball historian, I like to call myself, I just found that really interesting to sort of be that sort of have that sort of connector to basketball history of going back and trying to find signed cards that it's very difficult to find.
So are you buying cards that are signed by deceased players or living, or do you try to get them yourself?
Yeah, I don't really go out and get them myself. I do tend to go get them from the secondary market or whatever that's already been signed. And a lot of it is deceased. A lot of what I collect are like 61 Fleer basketball, and quite a few of those players have gone have deceased, passed away, or they've decided to stop signing altogether at this point in their lives. So it's hard to find them. Even like Bob Cousy recently decided to stop signing, and he's been a really good signer for a few years. But yeah, you get to those years, and it's hard to find anyone who's still signing, obviously. So if I would have started it, like 5 or 10 years ago, I definitely would have tried to been chasing a lot more actual signatures myself. But and it would have been a lot cheaper. So I do kind of wish I would have thought of doing that 10 years ago. But yeah,
I know. No, I'm in the same boat. Yeah, I mean, I got so, and we'll talk about this later, I'm sure, just so frustrated with the graded card market that I kind of pivoted to player autographs. And it's funny about like things changing. I was just saying, like when I was younger, and even when I first got back into the hobby in 2017, 2018, I really had no interest in player autograph cards. I thought most of them are probably fake, because I know just how easy it is. And but what I have evolved into is doing TTM or through the mail autographs of the players. And so over the winter, I picked the 1973 top set and just used some online sources to find the players. And I think I've got, I don't know, like 130 cards out of that set signed. And you appreciate that, like half the players are deceased, 50 years later. And, time is ticking on the rest of us. So it's like, I really want to get these players now, but, I wish I had done it 10 years ago, like yourself, because there's some, great players that I miss, great cards that I'll never get autographed. And there's some Hall of Famers that were signing for, pretty cheap money back then too. So it was more obtainable.
Yeah. Well, so when did you start doing your YouTube content? What sort of made you decide to go head first into doing that on a regular basis?
Yeah, I don't even remember the year. It was probably 2018 or 2019. And I have had a YouTube channel for a long time, another format, and I had successful videos that are like gotten millions of views doing other things. And so I knew how to do YouTube, But
Mhm.
I got really into the cards and thought, I really have something to say. I want to tell stories, and what it really forced me to do was to learn the editing part. And my other channel, I didn't do any of that really. It was just I was using Windows Movie Maker, which was very rudimentary editing, but it works okay without any training. So for the baseball card channel, I really wanted to do some kind of heavy editing and make it more professionalized because I thought, you know, the hobby could use something like that. It would make me stand out if I, am just on camera showing my cards. People have seen everything that I've got. I don't have anything unusual. And so I did that, but I also, um, I wanted to tell compelling stories. My background is really around like like confronting power dynamics and relationships, looking at institutions that are very powerful, and if they're misusing their power, just issues around equity, how money's distributed, like stuff like that. So the first project I really got into was and really motivated me was around looking at the impact of race on the players' card values. Now, I don't think it's as much of an issue in the basketball market, but in the baseball card market, there are players that are roughly equal. You could argue who's the better player, but both players are in the conversation, and there'll be huge discrepancies in the prices. So I'm talking like Mickey Mantle and Willie Mays, for example.
Yep.
There's exponential difference for the same year in a Mickey Mantle card, and trying to understand why that was, and really kind of showing people the numbers that bore that out. And what was interesting about that project is I had the first Beckett price guide that Dr. Beckett ever put out, and when you look in there, the prices of their cards were pretty much equal. There really wasn't much of discrepancy at all. In some years, Mays cards were worth more. But somehow over time, I think probably as the graded card market took off, there became this big differential in the prices. And so I wanted to explore why. And I can say that was the least positively reviewed video I've ever done, but I'm really glad I did it. And I feel like society has kind of come around to that idea because we have seen tremendous gains in values of cards like Roberto Clemente, especially Jackie Robinson now. The
Yeah.
hobby is becoming more diverse and kind of catching up with the rest of the culture. So, I felt it was an important video. And so I wanted to take on, kind of topics that people weren't talking about in the hobby, right or wrong, good or bad or whatever. Um, and it just kind of, plays into those interests of, doing kind of documentary or investigation type stuff. I've always just been interested in that. And I went to grad school and have had statistics and research classes. And I used to be in law enforcement too. So I'm really looking. I've always looked at digging kind of deep into answering some of these questions.
But yeah, and to me, that's always the most fascinating content. When you can really present that type of information, that type of research, background information on things that people may not even be aware of going on, whether it's from a financial or a value standpoint on the way cards are going, or just other things. Which you alluded to one of those earlier, and I wanted to go ahead and ask about it. Back in 2019, there was a bit of a scandal going on with vintage graded cards, vintage baseball mainly, but it also seeped into a lot of the other vintage markets as well. And as of course the issue with card trimming, especially when it pertains to some heavy hitters in the hobby industry during that time period, like PWCC. And a lot of things about card trimming has come to light again recently because of Evan Mathis. And there's a lot of people still kind of new in the hobby that kind of got back into it during the pandemic that probably don't actually know the history of some of these other things that's been going on for many, many years. You covered that in 2019 in great detail. But for those that may not be aware, could you kind of give a brief explanation of what you covered during that time period when it comes to the card trimming scandal?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, first of all, the credit goes to the guys on Blowout. I mean, I just reporting on what they
Yeah.
found. This is Super Dan and I think 314. There's a few guys in the Blowout Detective Agency, and I can't remember all of them, but they had done, I mean, heroes work really. And so what they had done, it all came to light from a 52 mantle that, if I remember the story, somebody had seen it and was offered for sale, but passed on it, and then saw the exact same card in a PSA holder, and it was obviously trimmed. It was the same card, and how PWC was selling this card, and it was disclosed, I think, to PWCC, but I can't remember the details. It's been 4 years, but I don't think they would take the card down from auction, and then Brent Higgins tried to rationalize why it was okay to be cutting up cards, and it really led to this whole unraveling of what had been going on at PSA and PWCC around just the volume of trimmed cards that were in the marketplace. And for those who are kind of new to it, the methods that the Blowout Detective guys did, this is on Blowout Cards Forum. So they would look at old auctions and they would find cards that had, every card has a unique identifier to it. There's print marks, there's fiber, there's just different telltale signs like a fingerprint. And they could go back into old auction listings and find where these cards sold maybe a year before. And then they would find the card in a newer PSA holder, or it could have been raw even, but they found it in a PSA holder with visibly different, where edges were trimmed off of it, where it looked really short in the PSA holder. So for example, like what some of these guys would do is buy, like I say, a PSA 7, any vintage card, and then they would trim it, and they'd break it out, trim it, and then they'd send it back to PSA, and it might be a PSA 9. So the guys from Blowout could see that, hey, this is the same card. There's these same dots right here by their head or on the back or whatever. It was very obvious that it was the same card. And these cards had, would sell for multipliers of thousands of dollars, depending on who it was. And I think it became really obvious because the way PSA holders their cards, a card that is, kind of comes from the factory, it will fit in that holder pretty well. It's pretty tight, where with these trimmed cards, if you grab the holder, start shaking it, you can hear the card shaking around inside like a maraca, I used to call it. And you can see in the photographs too that there's an obvious difference in the length and maybe the width of the cards. And that's how this all came to light. And I mean, the guys on Blowout are still doing this today. If you go on there, they're still exposing all kinds of cards that have been done. And, it gets to the point where, people were trimming $2 cards, modern cards, just because it was so easy to get away with it. PSA was not able to stop it. That's where I'm really critical of them, is they're the ones who are supposed to be the gatekeepers of the hobby. They were founded on the premise that we can't have, in the words of Joe Orlando, the ex-president, the wild, wild west. People need to know that they're buying real cards, not buying fakes. But in a really sick and twisted irony, what they have done is legitimized the fraud in the hobby by holdering these cards and saying these cards are authentic, these cards are high grade, when they've been doctored. And that's the situation we're in now. Is we probably don't even have a good idea of how many, thousands, hundreds of thousands, who knows how many cards over the decades have been trimmed this way.
Yeah, I mean, very famously, their very first card, the famous Honus Wagner card, turned out to be a trimmed card. So they literally started off their company with legitimizing the car that at one point, or for a really long time, was like the most expensive card in the hobby. And look, I still think that for the most part, PSA will still probably. And I don't know. I mean, I guess I kind of have also soured on the graded cards, the highly graded cards, and I have focused more on authenticating autographs and things like that. And so it's you definitely need a company like PSA to legitimize things that you are collecting. I think for the most part, as a collector, and obviously we have different grading companies, but at the same time, the other grading companies still they have weaknesses, or they have, or like, CSG I like, but CSG doesn't even attempt to do like authenticating autographs yet. So they may one
Okay.
day, but
Yeah.
SGC kind of used to, but they've kind of gone away from it and things like that. But in terms of grading, like, I mean, it's so crazy now with how the standards have gone away from companies like BGS, and so you don't have too many options. If you want your car to have a certain value in the market, PSA is still kind of obviously the high standard for most people. But at the same time, I do think it's important for people to understand that PSA has made a lot of mistakes over the course of their existence, and you're right. I would say a very high percentage of the highly graded vintage cards out there in the markets, probably more than half, have at one point been trimmed or altered in some way. And I think PSA kind of let that slide for a really long time, unfortunately.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I think that too. I mean, I don't know if you guys, other collectors, get some of these big auction catalogs in the mail, Heritage, REA, Golden, or whoever. Just look at the high graded cards in there that bring high prices. They all, I'd say most of them have a certification number starting in 0 or 1. Most of them are very loose in their holder. That was just a time when these cards were trimmed with impunity. I mean, I don't even know what detection efforts PSA had, because so many cards got through. And I think that's what bothers me. One of the things the most is that I don't think that they can tell you if a card was cut in 1968 or 2023. I'm not convinced that they know the difference, because so many of these cards got through. I just don't know. Like they knew the guys that were doing it, people that were insiders. And this hobby, there's a tight network of good old boys who've been around forever that know everybody. They know the dirt on each other, and they know who these guys are. It's not a surprise, but these folks were allowed to keep submitting cards year after year after year.
Yeah.
And, look what we've got now. I think any card in a high grade that's got an older certification number, it's probably trimmed. I mean, let's be realistic. These cards were targets because the money was so easy and there was no detection. The only way I would buy a card like that now is if it had a recent grade on it. If the cert number was like 5, 6, or 7 or something like that, it was pretty new.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think if I think buying vintage, if you have a love for vintage and you want to go get, a 52 Mickey Mantle or 54 Hank Aaron or whatever your Holy Grail card is, I think it's just important to know that, first of all, I don't think there's any reason why you shouldn't be looking actually at ones that are already labeled as altered or authentic altered or whatever the label is going to be for that particular grading company that you kind of prefer. Knowing though that you have that knowledge up front that it has been trimmed or something has happened to it in the past, and so you can make an educated determination of what the value of that card is at that point in time. But what happened with a lot of these, obviously, is that people weren't educated up front before buying those 8s and 9s and even 10s in some instances. And so you're talking about a swing of like 5 figures, 6 figures, maybe even 7 figures in some instances. And now if it comes out that card has in fact been detected as being trimmed, and let's say PSA does after the fact discontinue that pop number or that certification number, then they will never be able to resell that card for the same price that they originally got it for. So that's where the issue comes at hand. And I don't care what Evan Mathis and others have been trying to say recently, that it's not that big of a deal because it's been going on for forever. No, it is a big deal, and that's the reason why. It is simply fraud. If you want to still get into vintage cards, I say go into it, but you just have to be well educated on the history of those things.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I think, these guys know the history of this hobby from the beginning was you don't trim cards, and if you do, you disclose it. I know, like in the art world, it's okay if you disclose what you've done. In the comic book world, it's okay. But in this hobby, it's not okay to be trimming, altering, pressing, dipping, whatever you do, rebuilding corners. It's not okay to do that without disclosing that that's been done so that the buyer is aware. And these guys knew that, but the greed, I think the greed, the like you talked about, the exponential dollar amount has just, it's made people rationalize how that's okay. So, Brent Higgins kind of started it in 2019 by saying that it was okay to conserve cards. That was him saying that, that's not what the hobby thinks, and that's not what we believe. But unfortunately, because all of these, it's kind of become a fait accompli, because all these trimmed cards are in PSA holders. I think directly or indirectly, PSA has said it's okay to conserve cards. It's okay to work on cards to make their grades better. Like, because of the sheer volume of the trimmed cards in the hobby, that decision has kind of been made for us already without us really having a say in it. It's sad because PSA just has a tremendous market position. They have almost monopoly power, and they have no accountability at all.
Yeah. Well, I really recommend anyone who would like to learn more about what occurred back in 2019 to find Keith's YouTube channel and take a look at his old videos on this topic, because I think it's a good history lesson of what occurred then, especially if you're really upset or you're really interested in what's going on right now with the Evan Mathis stuff. What were your thoughts when you first saw or heard about the Evan Mathis video? And I don't know if you listened to his interviews on Sports Card Nonsense afterwards, or anyone else's sort of talking points on that.
No, I didn't. I've been kind of away from it. I feel like I've made so many videos, like, what else can I do, like, to call attention
Yeah.
to issues like this? So I kind of had deliberately stepped away. I knew of his history before. I just kind of shook my head. I don't know. I think there's just something wrong with him, frankly. Like the way that video came out, I saw a little bit of it, just how he can just, come out and do it like that and rationalize it, like it's okay. I mean, that was his behavior on Blowout, though. He was kind of ridiculing the guys who were calling it out and saying that trimming cards was okay. So to me, it was just like another part of his persona.
Yeah. Well, I know recently you haven't been able to do as much content as you have done in the past. So what are some of the things that you're kind of focusing on now, whether it's stuff you're collecting or just stuff or projects that you're kind of focusing on? Yeah, what are things like for you nowadays in your world of collecting and being involved in the hobby?
Yeah, I mean, I think I said before, I'm mostly doing TTM autographs. So I finished up this 1973 top set, and
Hmm.
now I'm working on some Hall of Fame cards. Just trying to get some of these guys while I still can. And like my last video I did was just talking about how some of these guys signed for really cheap, $5, $10, $20 to get, a really good player. And it's authentic, I think anyway. But I actually, I still think about these issues with PSA, and my next project I'm working on, it's going to take a while, is around the Dimitri Young collection. I don't know if the viewers are familiar, because it's a baseball collection primarily. I don't think he did basketball, but Dimitri Young was a baseball player, and I don't even remember the year. It was like in the 90s, and
Hmm.
he decided to build the ultimate uh, rookie card collection. So he went out to find perfect 10 examples of every Hall of Fame rookie card he could get. He expanded it to much more, but this project is interesting because I think it really it puts together all of the issues I've had with PSA all in one project. So if you look at the cards, and there's pictures of the cards today, you see first how he got preferential treatment. but from PSA. I mean, his name is on the labels. You see card trimming. If you look at some of these cards, they're really, I mean, it's really sad how butchered they are. Like, so just to give a little bit of background. So when a card comes out, I'll show you. This is a card I got when I was a kid. I don't know if it can, yeah.
Mhm.
This is how Topps cards came out, back in the 70s. They're really off center. Like anyone
Right.
who collected back then knows you didn't get a perfect card out of the pack, But I think what these guys did was they looked at like vending cards, and I have some vending cards. Vending cards were cut a little bit shorter because they had to fit into the machine to be dispensed. So Topps trimmed them a little bit differently. They have a variation in size. And I think what has happened where this all kind of started is that there's a variation in card size, like, so a card, I think it's like, what's it, 3.5 by 5.5 or something. I don't know the exact dimension of a card, but there's this ideal dimension, and there's a variation though, because there's vending cards. And people who were familiar with PSA's procedures, or who in some cases worked for PSA, went out and knew these variations and trimmed the cards down to that variation. And so some of these cards in the Dimitri Young collection were trimmed really bad. Like a card that is in a vending box really might have one edge that's short, like, so maybe like the long part might be short here, but some of his cards have this edge cut too. So it's cut on two sides, which is physically impossible. Topps never cut their cards that way. So like some of the most famous examples, like his Ozzie Smith rookie, Eddie Murray rookie, the Pete Rose rookie, Ricky Henderson rookie. If you look at images of those cards, especially on the back, you can see really jagged edges where they were cut and how there's gaps on both sides. And, the fact that he got those cards graded through PSA, it's an embarrassment for PSA, really. It's really shameful. So he got the trimming, there's preferential treatment. And then the other issue that I've been big on is pop control. How PSA, whether it's Pokemon, basketball, or whatever, when your cards are graded, it's not just objectively, what does your card look like? It's who's the player on the card, what's the value of the card. Those factors enter into the grading decision. I mean, people that have supported PSA don't like to believe that, but my videos run the numbers. I look at millions of grading decisions, and in every case where there's a very valuable card in that set, that card is graded impossibly tough. It's very difficult to get a PSA 10. So that plays into the Dimitri Young collection too, because he had some cards with very low pops, like the Pete Rose rookie. There's only 110. He had it. The Ozzie Smith rookie, the pop on that is 5. He had that. And these are cards that are trimmed, and they've got his name on the label, and PSA, I think, exploited him for marketing purposes too, so I'm kind of giving away my video. I haven't even started on it yet, really, just the research, but that is the project that I'm working on now, is kind of tying all of these arguments that I've had with PSA into one project.
Well, that absolutely sounds like a fascinating project. I appreciate you sharing a little bit of that with us. Yeah, I mean, there's an obvious correlation, I suppose, if you wanted to say that, about guys like Dimitri Young and Evan Matthews, who were obviously former professional athletes and perhaps getting some preferential treatments with PSA. I mean, it's hard not to at least say, look, this obviously, the appearance of this obviously looks bad, like you said, there are a lot of cards that were like low pop or pop zeros that all of a sudden, this one guy has an example of almost every single major rookie card in a really high grade.
Right.
And as you said, I mean, what do you think the actual percentage would be of cards that were actually perfectly centered, that were distributed and manufactured prior to 1980? It's probably like less than 10%, right? Maybe even lower.
No, I mean, I can go through my binders of cards I pulled from packs. There's a few cards, there's a handful, but most of the cards were off center, and we didn't even look at that back in the day. And that's where, I think there's this kind of symbiotic relationship around the trimmers and the money, because people have been conditioned to want those cards. But let's be honest, there's really not that many cards like that were ever produced.
Yeah.
So the market needs those cards, and the trimmers are there to supply the market. They are creating these cards out of cards that are mid grade, or I think the trimmers use the idea of good bones. Like, the card might have some flaws, might be slightly off center, but it looks pretty good otherwise. It's got good corners, and then they trim it, to make it look like they think it should be. Um,
And
it's
that is a good,
it's just a very unrealistic standard. I think if
yeah.
you were around back then, none of us expected these cards. We didn't even look at that stuff. We didn't. Centering wasn't even a thing until graded cards came around.
No, you're right. And I even was trying to remember myself as like, when did I really start paying attention to centering? I don't think I really started paying attention to it until like maybe 5 or 6 years ago or so, something like that. Like, yeah, I wonder when centering really became such a big deal for the hobby community as a whole, because that is literally all you hear about. Like, whenever people collect vintage in particular, it's always about the centering. It's
Yeah.
hardly ever about the edges or corners or even the surface. In most cases, it's usually centering first. And
Yeah.
I wonder when that kind of got started.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I know when I first got back in, I didn't even know about centering. I didn't even care. The first grade of cards I bought were off centered. It wasn't until I got more into YouTube and saw how important that was that I realized, I need to get with the program, because, you're leaving money on the table buying off center cards. And,
Hmm.
it's unfortunate, but I don't know if it was, YouTube or PSA, or who did it, but I mean, PSA changed the market in so many ways. Like, if you look at before PSA, we had a grading scale that was like 6 things. It was like, poor, fair, good, very good, fine, or something, and mint. And if you look, like, if you buy cards from Greg Morris, he does that. He still uses that scale. That's the established scale for decades in the hobby. And it works. I think it works really well. You might disagree if something's mint, or, or near mint, or
Yeah.
whatever. But what PSA did was they took that, maybe a 6.5, 6-point scale, and they turned it into a 10-point scale. Then that wasn't good enough. So they turned it into, I think, like an 18-point scale with the half grades. And it really put the focus on the upper end, because they know, they're not stupid. There's a psychological effect of rich people want to own the best of something, like, you want to own the best example. I don't know if it's
Right.
an anxiety issue, but PSA really plays into that. So it creates this market for the upper 1% that never existed before. Like, back in the 80s, a mint Ricky Henderson card could be $100. Now it could be, $900. It could be $250,000. Like, it's just focused so much on this upper end.
Yeah. And where my thoughts keep going when it comes to the hobby is, why shouldn't there be more regulation in the hobby? I had a few interviews back, a gentleman by the name Reserved Investments, who has a YouTube channel that talks a lot about all the different antiques and collectibles markets, and how you can't really compare them to actual regulated investments like stocks and bonds and things like that, because pretty much all of it. I mean, there are some antiques markets like art that is a little bit more regulated, and that's gotten to that point over the years, and of course that's been going on for hundreds of years. So we're still relatively new in comparison to that type of collectible, but still, I do wonder if we ever get to that point where pretty much everyone, or the majority of people out there, really start to kind of realize we probably need some sort of regulation, and especially when it comes to policing all these third-party grading services and elite auction houses that are in bed with these grading services, and sounds like they'll be in bed with the actual manufacturers of these products in the future, like Fanatics and all these things that are just kind of woven together. But who is regulating them, and who is actually governing them, and making sure things have an equal footing for everyone involved? I think we need to kind of get to that point at some point in this hobby.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's it's a big barrier. There really is no regulation. Fraud prosecutions are extremely rare. I mean, with all the stuff that happened in 2019, I think most of us were certain that people like Brent Higgins and Gary Moser, the chief card doctor, were going to federal prison. And from what I understand, the FBI agent just retired, and there's been nothing. And occasionally you hear about art counterfeiters. Like the FBI might do a big investigation. It just, these things don't go anywhere. I think there's still this, kind of reputation that cards are still like kids things or something, or we're embarrassed about them. It's just not taken seriously. But we're talking about probably a multi-billion-dollar industry with no regulation, with rampant fraud, and very little checks on that. I mean, it's just an example. I get so critical about eBay because people know that there's rampant shill bidding, but there's no tools for collectors to really detect it. When I was on eBay early, like 20 years ago, you could really look at people's feedbacks and their history, and you could tell someone was shill bidding, and you could report them. But now eBay just says, well, we'll handle it. We have our own tools. But they kicked PWCC off, but that was, I think, after they were probably tipped off from the feds that something was going on. I mean, like, we see shill bidding all the time, and there's some ways you can tell, like when people have low feedback or 100% of their bids are with one seller. There's stuff like that, but we don't ever hear about people getting kicked off. There's no penalty for that. I mean, any one of us, if I wanted to go on your auctions, Kurt, and shill bid your auctions, who's stopping? There's nobody stopping that.
Nope. And you have so many new market platforms like Whatnot, where it kind of is almost like the Wild Wild West when it comes to breakers, and how you can literally just start a breaking company on Whatnot, and you don't have to have really any sort of sales history or feedback history or anything like that. And now you see all sorts of things happening with Whatnot breakers and people getting scammed. Unfortunately, it's putting a really bad light on the whole industry off of this one, marketing or market platform, e-commerce platform, I should say.
Right.
And we see, there's so many interesting things happening in the hobby right now with all the different things that are at our disposal, from auction houses to e-commerce platforms to social media. People buying and trading on Facebook and Instagram, even that's much more popular than it used to be. It's exciting as a collector to have all these things at your disposal, to find things that you've been searching for years probably, and it's a lot easier to find a lot of these things. But at the same time, you have to really stay on your toes on every single one of these different types of platforms and know what the risks are, because there's different risk with almost any single different type of thing that you're getting on nowadays, and buying or even just sort of communicating about cards in your collection. You have to just be real careful.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's where I get critical too, is that it shouldn't be a few guys on YouTube calling for change or guys on Blowout exposing this. The hobby has a whole pretty, modern infrastructure of media companies, $1 million auction houses, grading companies, but no, they're silent. They're not saying we think this is important. We want to stamp out fraud in the hobby. We want to put some effort behind it ourselves. They're silent. They're not saying anything, and I learned this in grad school. We were studying about political revolutions, right? And you might wonder how this has to do with cards, but political revolutions are not successful until kind of the established class decides they've had enough and they want to go along with it. So like the wealthy class, the military, the police. And that's what we have in the hobby. Like the people that are kind of the established institutions in the hobby are not interested. The registry set collectors, the guys who are the big whales in the hobby, who have millions of their own dollars in this, are not calling for change. I mean, they're holding a lot of these fraudulent cards. I think they have too much skin in the game to say we want things to change. I think they've just kind of gone along to get along, and they're happy to kind of benefit from the system, I suppose. Like a lot of people are benefiting from the system, and the people that are holding the bag, unfortunately, are mostly the regular collectors who are just unaware of what's going on.
Yeah, and a lot of people who got into it post pandemic when the prices skyrocketed like crazy, and a lot of that probably had to do with market manipulation by a lot of these content creators and people that had a lot of skin in the game over the years. And it's unfortunate. It's real unfortunate, but of course, we saw this across the board with almost all the different collectible markets out there. But yeah, now with prices coming back down to earth, and just people got into things because of hype and because of watching other people on YouTube or Instagram get into these same things without a ton of knowledge or a ton of background and history on a lot of these things. And I'm trying to keep up the knowledge for people who still want to collect, because I still want to collect, and I think you still want to collect too, despite all this history and all this knowledge we've talked about. But I think that's the reason we do it, is because we know about it, we know it exists, and I think we want to make sure plenty of other people do too, and stay in this hobby for the right reason, and to find the things that they're truly passionate about collecting, but with the knowledge of the risks and things like that that's potentially involved with still collecting going forward.
Yeah, again, I think we're on the same page. It would probably surprise people to know that I own like tens of thousands of dollars of PSA slabs, because that's where the money is. Like that's going to be my retirement. I know, like, that's where the greatest value is, but I also go into it kind of understanding like what's behind it all. At first, when I found out all the trimming stuff, I sold a lot of my cards that look questionable, and I kind of kick myself now because nobody really cares enough. They're still paying top dollar for these cards. Some of them went up in value so much, but I still love the cards, and I want to have something that at least when I retire, that I can sell for at least what I got or more, hopefully more. But so I'm very critical of the system, but I feel like I have to live in it too, and so it's helpful for me to be educated about how things really operate. So I'm not surprised or get taken.
Sure. Well, we're going to try and end on more of a fun note. Because this is still a fun hobby,
It is. Yeah. And, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't. Yeah.
Absolutely. Me, myself as well. Other than the sets that you're still collecting and trying to complete, do you think that there's some sort of an end game for you, that if you ever got to that point, you would stop collecting, or are there other sort of individual cards that are at the top of your wish list, if you got those, that maybe you can see an end in sight to your collecting journey?
That's tough, because the cards that I would really want are unobtainable for me, salary wise or whatever. There's just some landmark cards that, some T206, like a green cob, or, stuff like that is just not obtainable.
Especially, you can say it. I mean, my card is a 61 Fleer Will Chamberlain sign, and it will probably not be attainable to me, because I don't think I will ever be able to afford that if I had the opportunity to buy it, So I've got several of those of his base rookie sign in the PSA DNA pop report. I think there's still only five. So okay. there's probably like around 10 or so for sure that are out there. Yeah, and they don't come up very often. And when they do, man, there's a lot of people that really try and snatch those. And so, the last several that have come up have gone for around six figures. So there's those on my list as well. And so I'm still a dreamer. It's like maybe one day it could happen. So you never know, still dream about your green tie cob, or I don't know if you wonders with some of the others, like do you have like the 33 Gaudis or any of the other ones that on your list?
Not really. I mean, I think for a long time I wanted a Hank Aaron rookie, because he's my favorite player and such an inspiration and a hero to me. But I think when cards start costing, $5,000 or $10,000, I can appreciate it from a picture. It doesn't make sense. I'm a social worker by trade, so I had to build my collection on a budget, kind of over time, and being really patient to find the right cards. I don't know. I mean, sure, I'd love to have a Clemente rookie, a Jackie Robinson card. Like his what's his 56 tops would be a nice card to have. But
Yeah.
I feel like I'm still kind of stuck as a kid in some ways. I got all those cards that I wanted when I was younger, and so now like I'm pretty much just kind of focused on autographs. And what I will do is take like some of my favorite sets and build up high grade Hall of Fame cards. So like the 1968 set, I have all the Hall of Famers in PSA 8 except for Mantle and Ryan, who are much more expensive. So those are in a lower grade, a 6 and a 7. But so I might do that with some of the other sets, is just find some higher grade examples, because I think those are good investments over time. I've seen the value of those cards just, I mean, they've gone down since their 2021 highs, but they are still, I mean, it's ridiculous. The ROI is like they're worth twice as much what I paid for them just 5 years ago. So that's the kind of stuff that I like. I just think if you have a high grade example of something that people want that you would have no trouble selling, that's the direction I like to go. Like I learned that with comic books, because I had collected comics in high school, and when I went to sell them, I learned that a lot of the comics I thought were big deals back in the 1980s were not. And the condition, if the condition wasn't good, they really weren't worth much. So I decided in baseball cards to really buy stuff that's popular and is in the highest grade that I can reasonably afford. And so that's kind of my mantra for collecting graded cards.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think despite all that's been happening with the scandals and whatnot, I still think that will be very true in this hobby for many years to come.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and I think we were talking before about the grading companies. I do think the grading companies are necessary too. I want them to live up to the ideals that they should have. To be objective arbitrators of what these cards are.
Yeah.
I don't know if I have a lot of hope of that happening, but that's kind of my goal. That's what I'd love to see.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe one day. No. Hey, well, thank you so much for all the content you've provided, all the history and background information that you've given in this hobby over the years. Thank you so much for coming on tonight to talk to me about it. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Sure, Kurt. Yeah, thanks. I really enjoyed it. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. All right. Talk to you soon.
Okay.